This was organized in a very short period of time because we wanted to take advantage of the fact that we are here after the Antalya Diplomacy Forum. So we're grateful that you were able to attend today. My name is Dr. Jeanene Mitchell. I am the co-founder as well as the executive director of Restart Initiative. And if you aren't familiar with our organization, we are a nonprofit that is founded in the Republic of Georgia. And we have the mission of building connections for economic and social development in the South Caucasus. Our activities include fostering dialogue between, on issues germane to the normalization of relations between Armenia and Azerbaijan, among other things that we do. And some of the other interviews that we've done with people on this topic are on our YouTube channel. Our channel is called Daha, and you can find a link to our interviews, and some interviews actually with Arman Grigoryan himself, through our website on our Daha link. So what we're going to do today is we're going to actually film the first part of the conversation between Dr. Arman Grigoryan and Emin Milli. We will be posting this on our Daha YouTube site, and then after that, we're going to turn off the cameras and we're going to get in a more informal discussion with everyone. Everything is on the record. This is a closed meeting because we wanted to keep the conversation intimate, but everything will be on the record. So coming to our topic today. Of course, when we talk about normalization between Armenia and Azerbaijan, we can't exclude talking about Turkey. Turkey, of course, played a key role in the outcome of the 44-day war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, as well as it is connected to its own normalization process with Armenia is connected to the normalization process between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And if these processes weren't complex enough themselves, we now have the war in Ukraine, which has heralding a new international order. I think that's probably not too strong of a statement. And there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty surrounding the role that Russia will play in the region. And I feel like I need to pause at this point and acknowledge the tremendous human suffering and loss that is happening right now. What we will be talking about today focuses on the impact of Russia's war with Ukraine, as well as Russia's agenda on the region. And of course, many things remain uncertain, except the fact that the implications are going to be profound. So this is what we hope to discuss today, even if we can just scratch the surface. So I mentioned that our format is that we're going to begin by talking with Arman and Emin, and then we will move to a group discussion. I would like to introduce you to our speakers. Dr. Arman Grigoryan is an associate professor in the International Relations Department at Lehigh University. He received his PhD in political science at Columbia University, where his dissertation was a study of escalatory effects of third-party interventions. He also holds a master's in international relations from the University of Chicago and an undergraduate degree with a major in Middle Eastern studies from the Yerevan State University. Professor Grigoryan has published articles on interventions, ethnofederalism, the relationship between war and democracy, and US foreign policy. His publications have appeared in International Security, the International Studies Quarterly, the International Political Science Review, and Ethnopolitics. Emin Milli is the founder and chairman of Restart Initiative. He has been a public advocate for dialogue between Armenia and Azerbaijan during and after the Second Karabakh War, and his co-authored pieces on Karabakh have been published in Newsweek, Al Jazeera, and the International Business Times. From 2002 to 2004, Milli directed the Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Azerbaijan, and in 1999 and 2000, he was the coordinator of the International Republican Institute in Azerbaijan. He has worked as an advisor and consultant to the Council of Europe, the European Union, and the German Technical Cooperation Agency. Milli holds a BA in International Law from Baku State University and an MA from the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies. So thank you to both of you for being here today for this conversation. So I'd like to start things off with what is perhaps an obvious question. Why do we need to be thinking about the impact of the war in Ukraine in a trilateral way? What is really at stake here when we think about relations between Turkey, Armenia, and Azerbaijan? And Arman, let's start with you.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for coming to this meeting, for subjecting yourselves to our ideas, our conversation. Why is what is happening in Ukraine relevant for the processes in the South Caucasus? I think the answer is fairly simple. However the conflict in Ukraine ends, it is going to have profound implications for the balance of power in not only in Ukraine but in areas surrounding Russia. It is going to affect Russia's international role and it's going to affect profoundly Russia's international role and Russia's policy. And the Caucasus obviously is an area where Russia is deeply involved, where Russia is strategically involved, and it cannot remain unaffected by those changes. And if we're thinking about this, if you think about it, I guess it's easier to imagine the consequences of the war by simplifying it into two scenarios. What happens if Russia prevails and what happens if Russia fails. I understand that may be too much of a simplification, but for analytical purposes it's probably justified. Now, if Russia fails, which I think is the more unlikely outcome, it is going to create possibly a very difficult situation in Russia domestically. Russia is going to start looking inward. Russia is going to have to preoccupy itself with all sorts of political problems internally. And also it might mean weakening of Russia's influence in the South Caucasus, in more, if we go too far in imagining a catastrophe for Russia, even Russian withdrawal from the South Caucasus. Anyway, so a failure of Russia might mean a vacuum in the South Caucasus, a fundamental change in the distribution of power. And whenever you have a vacuum in any region, that generates competition for power, competition for influence, and such competition usually is rife with conflict, rife with instability. So I think I think Russia's failure may result in such instability in the Caucasus, and that might well be quite dangerous, quite catastrophic, and at the very least it will be very dangerous. It will be a very dangerous situation for the region. If Russia prevails, it will in all likelihood result in two things. One is going to be the deepening of the rift between Russia and the West. Kind of one cannot think about this without imagining a new Cold War rising out of this, and the new Iron Curtain coming down in Europe and in areas on Russia's periphery. And one consequence might be that countries in the region, including Armenia and Azerbaijan, Armenia more so than Azerbaijan, but these countries having to make a much more definitive choice in terms of their belonging to one camp or the other. So that will put these countries in also. I mean, it will be also undesirable for these countries to be put in that situation, but that probably will be the likely outcome of Russia's success. And these countries will probably become more closely tied. They will become more closely associated with Russia in such an eventuality. So that, I think, is in essence what may be the likely consequences for the Caucasus, depending on how the war ends. I'm just going to pause here and see what Emin has to say. Please.
Thank you. You know, when before February 24th, when this escalation event started in Ukraine, when I was talking to many Western experts, Azerbaijani experts, I think many didn't. I think none of the people I talked with actually, or I listened to, really expected that Russia would do what it has done on February 24th. And there was always this underestimating of what Putin and Putin's Russia is capable of. Even if, you know, omens were there, like, as you know, if you would listen to Putin, what he was saying, there was always this, you know, pink elephant. I don't want to recreate Soviet Union. I don't want to recreate Soviet Union. And he always, you know, emphasized that this was a big, you know, historic tragedy that Soviet Union collapsed. And from everything he was doing, you know, for me it was very obvious that this is, you know, kind of, this is the direction the Russian policy is going, Putin is going. But honestly, quite honestly, even I did not expect that he will be ready to go for a, you know, full-scale war, with especially with Ukraine. But it happened. And what it means now, I think it is really difficult after we see so many experts failed to predict what would happen in Ukraine on this scale, now to try to think what can happen, you know, in our region, what the implication will be. But let's try. I think that regardless if Russia wins or loses, and, you know, I think we need also to think about how we define loss and victory, and we may also see the situation where Russia defines victory very differently than the rest of the world. But regardless of if Russia wins or loses this war in Ukraine, I think the world has changed. I think that it will have very serious and, I'm afraid, negative implications also in the South Caucasus, because if Russia wins, we're gonna live in a very different world, especially neighbors of Russia, including Armenia and Azerbaijan. We will live with Russia, which will be, I think, more aggressive, more assertive, and you know, how much Russia will want to, I cannot say what they will do, you know, globally, but regionally, in its immediate neighborhood, of course, Russia's power and influence and assertiveness will grow immensely. And what it means, you know, we can discuss, we can imagine. It will definitely bring to more and more loss of sovereignty by the countries of that neighbor Russia. If it loses, again, we can talk about, you know, how they define the loss. I think they will never call it loss, even if they lose. Like, they will never say that, you know, they lost. Putin will try to sell this as victory in Russia anyway. But if they loses, if Russia is losing this war, then it again, in my view, it doesn't promise anything good to our region, because after this loss, Russia would want probably, and Putin will have to come up with some smaller but quicker victory. And I'm afraid we can look at Moldova, Georgia, and if we could see that entire world could watch how the US, the NATO were reiterating and repeating that they will not send soldiers to Ukraine, they will not create no-fly zones, and it's basically up to Ukrainian army to defend Ukraine, and countries like in Armenia there are already Russian military bases. In Georgia, half of Georgia is anyway gone, and the remaining part, if we see Russian tanks rolling in 2008, something stopped Putin, but I don't think anything what can stop him in Georgia. And if Georgia is gone, regardless of Azerbaijan's very special relationship with Turkey, which puts Azerbaijan in a better position than, I guess, Georgia and Armenia, but it's still Azerbaijan last year, signed this Shusha declaration with Turkey, which basically creates a commitment for Turkey and Azerbaijan. If anyone, attacks Turkey or Azerbaijan, they mutually protect each other. But I think that even this does not, protect Azerbaijan from these changing realities in the region, because Azerbaijan's entire connections, they all go from, with Europe, with the rest of the world, they basically go through Georgia. And what it would mean for Azerbaijan, I guess, it would be, it would mean more and more dependence on Russia. And we could see even the way Aliyev's visit in Moscow was designed. It was very intimidating for Azerbaijan, and I would say also in some way insulting, because from what we know from public sources, this declaration of alliance with Russia, which is very important to say, cannot be equaled really in its content with the declaration, Shusha declaration that Azerbaijan signed with Turkey, but it is still, it was planned maybe for a year, but only 20 days before the war started in Ukraine, before the meeting with Putin, Aliyev was invited. So you can see it was really orchestrated just after the recognition by Russia of Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. So Aliyev was, I think, the first, foreign head of state meeting Putin. And he put him at the table of, I don't know, what is it, 20, 30 meters away, as Macron and all his entire government. And also the day of the meeting was the day exactly when Turkmen-Chai agreement between Russia and Iran was signed in 1828, exactly the same day, and Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs posted this on when Azerbaijan, so for those of you who don't know, that was the agreement where the northern part of Azerbaijan, become also part of Russia. So this and as we know, Putin loves symbolism very much, and all this was very threatening, very intimidating. There was a political theater, which I think gives us just the, how should I say, like the just pre-taste of what may come to our region, and not just to Armenia and Georgia, but as I said, I think that also for Azerbaijan. So I think our entire region is just steps away from a totally new reality.
what is winning and what is losing for Russia? And actually, you had framed this, Arman, as prevailing and failing. Could you talk a little bit more about what exactly that means? What does prevailing look like for, what are the implications of Russia's prevailing on the Turkey-Armenia relationship as well as the Armenia-Azerbaijan relationship? And what happens if Russia fails?
Well, prevailing in Ukraine, I think actually I may have a slight disagreement with Emin on the issue of how much freedom Vladimir Putin has with regard to framing the victory or defeat. I mean, the Russian government has been very specific about what they will consider the accomplishment of their strategic goal in Ukraine, and that is essentially a commitment of Ukraine to remain neutral. Now, there are also the demands regarding Crimea, and recognition of Crimea and the Donbas region as part of Russia, but I think the primary motive of this operation was to make sure that Ukraine stays out of NATO and Ukraine remains a neutral state at the very least. Now, maybe after this war, if Russia prevails, Ukraine will become basically a satellite state of Russia, but I think the principal goal was to keep Ukraine out of NATO. And I think that also has been the primary motive of Russia in this conflict. Now, and to answer your question, I guess it is precisely in the same context that Russia looks at its relations with a lot of its other neighbors, including the Caucasus. I mean, the war in Georgia, obviously its proximate cause was the escalation in South Ossetia, but I think it's fair to say that the context of NATO expansion, potential membership of Georgia in NATO was also the major reason why that escalation happened in 2008. And let's not forget that that's when, shortly before that war, was the Bucharest summit when the United States adopted the policy of opening the door for NATO membership for Georgia and Ukraine. So I think the name of the game from Russia's perspective is to keep the post-Soviet space out of NATO's reach, to maintain Russian strategic monopoly in those areas, and to be the main arbiter in all the relations that happen and all the processes that take place in those regions. And when I say to be the main arbiter in those processes, I suppose the best example of it is Russia's role in the Armenian-Azerbaijan conflict, in the Armenian-Azerbaijan negotiations, where at least for the last 5 to 7 years, Russia has been the main third actor, the main third party, the main mediator of this conflict, and also after the war, it became the only country that deployed a peacekeeping force and acted essentially as the sole mediator between Armenia and Azerbaijan, although formally the Minsk group still exists. The Minsk group still is the format for the negotiations, for the settlement of the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, but everybody understands that Russia is playing a very special role there. Now, what happens if Russia fails? What would it look like? What would the Russian failure look like? I mean, one can imagine various scenarios. One easy answer to that question would be Russian failure to achieve its military and political goals and eventual withdrawal from Ukraine without being able to impose its preferred political solution on the country. Another form of failure would be if Russia gets stuck in some kind of a counterinsurgency campaign in Ukraine without any conclusive result, and Russia keeps bleeding, and its isolation and its political and economic isolation deepens over time. So it might be a more lengthy process, kind of not an event of failure, but a process of failure. And in all of these in all of these eventualities, obviously Russia's attention and resources are not limitless. They are finite, and Russia will have to make choices about where it concentrates its energies on, where it concentrates its resources on, and you know, if it requires too much of Russia's attention, if Ukraine requires too much of Russia's attention, then it might come at the expense of Russia's involvement and ability to act as forcefully as it has been up to this point in the Caucasus. And you know, we already. I don't want to go too far with this argument, but at least according to some people, the recent escalation of tensions between Armenia and Azerbaijan, some people are attributing to the fact that Russia is now preoccupied in Ukraine, and this has been seen as a window of opportunity for Azerbaijan to act more forcefully and to extract certain concessions from Armenia, which, you know, might not have been as easily done if Russia was not otherwise preoccupied. And if this is true, and again, I'm not insisting on this, I'm just talking about this more as a hypothesis. If this is true, then one can easily imagine that further weakening of Russia, further reduction of its influence in the region, will only feed that process, will only fuel that process, and that, you know, has all sorts of implications for reordering things in the region, all sorts of implications for whether the processes that have been in place, that have been evolving since the end of the war in 2020, whether they will continue as they were or whether the logic will change, and we will see something else. So that's pretty much what I meant about Russia's, the scenarios of Russia prevailing or failing, and its implications for the South Caucasus.
So you touched briefly on what is happening between Armenia and Azerbaijan right now, but can you talk a little bit more about what is going on, and perhaps even some of the relations between what happens internationally between these countries, but also how this affects domestic politics as well?
So what has been happening, for those of you who haven't been following it too closely, for the last couple of weeks, maybe a little more, the tensions have escalated. And there have been some skirmishes on the Armenian-Azerbaijani border. Near the Yeresk region, there was a skirmish, and also there have been some skirmishes in Karabakh proper. There has been this issue of the gas pipeline being out of commission, and then, you know, some repairs were necessary, but Azerbaijan was not allowing these repairs to be made. And there has been a particularly tense situation in a village called Khramort in Karabakh, and so the temperature has gone up considerably. And I should point out also that for some time, for maybe a couple of weeks, if not longer, the Azerbaijani rhetoric, the rhetoric of the Azerbaijani leaders before those events, had become a lot more conciliatory. And in that period, I thought this perhaps is a sign that most outstanding and difficult issues have been resolved in the negotiations, and we're heading toward some kind of a peace treaty, some kind of a resolution of that issue, and that peace treaty will be signed soon. But that didn't happen, and again, it kind of coincided with the escalation in Ukraine temporarily, and it wasn't just these skirmishes. I mean, two other things are important to point out, to mention. One is the decision. There was an announcement a few days ago that Azerbaijan is now going to build an alternative road through Iran, which was presented and framed as, well, we were not able to come to terms with Armenia and what the status of that communication would be between Azerbaijan proper, mainland of Azerbaijan, and Nakhichevan. So that has reached an impasse. Otherwise that road would not have been necessary. Or at least it was framed as an alternative to the road that would be built through Zangezur, through Sunik, and the other thing, of course, was the presentation of the Azerbaijani document with the 5 points, the conditions for normalization of relations. And what is interesting about that is, these things, if things were going well, they would be negotiating these things, right? They wouldn't publicize them, and they wouldn't present them in the form of preconditions and in a form of an ultimatum. But this is also a sign that they've reached an impasse on some issues, and I think the main problem is the kind of different framings and understandings between Armenia and Azerbaijan of Azerbaijan's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Right? So the Armenian side insists on recognizing Azerbaijan's territorial integrity and recognize Azerbaijan's borders to do the delimitation of borders, but they see it as separate from resolving the issue of the status of Nagorno-Karabakh. And they think that there is still something to negotiate there, there is still something to decide there. The Azerbaijani position is well known. There is nothing to talk about. It has been resolved. Karabakh is not going to have any special status, and it is going to be just another region of Azerbaijan, and its Armenian citizens will just receive Azerbaijani citizenship, and that's the end of it. So this is the impasse now, and you know that the Armenian government or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs appealed to the Minsk group in response to the publication of that document, insisting that the Minsk group should be activated and these negotiations should continue. Of course, one can wonder how the United States and Russia are going to sit there and act as mediators. I can't imagine that, but purely from a formal perspective, that process has not been, that the Minsk group format has not been disbanded, and that process has not been killed, even though the Azerbaijani leadership insists on it being irrelevant anymore. The more relevant thing, of course, is not the Minsk group format, but the fact that Russia, being the most important third-party actor in this conflict, also does not think that the status issue is resolved, and Russia insists on taking the status issue out of this process and initially concentrating on a peace treaty and normalization before the status issue can be addressed later on. So that's kind of what has been happening recently, and it is easy to see that we are now at an impasse. Quite clearly, the negotiations have hit a wall, and I think again, a lot will depend on how the conflict in Ukraine ends, and with Russia's ability to reconcentrate its attention on this conflict. Maybe there will be a new impetus for continuing the negotiations and moving that. Now, you asked me about domestic politics as well, but I've already spoken too long, so I'm going to let Emin say a few words, and later on we'll address the effects of domestic politics and its relevance as well.
Well, Emin, then I'll pose the question to you about domestic politics. How are the developments at the international level between Armenia and Azerbaijan impacting domestic politics in Azerbaijan?
Before answering your question, I would like to add something to what Arman was saying. So Arman more or less described the position of Armenia, position of Azerbaijan, possible implications. I want to point out to something that we have seen recently in Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, that sometimes, for example, during the recent war, 44 days war, nobody expected the position that Russia had on this conflict. I mean, Armenia was expecting that Russia would intervene on behalf of Armenia. Nobody in Azerbaijan was expecting that Russia would keep, even if they intervened at the end, but that they would wait so long. So why I'm bringing this up? Because again and again, what we observe is the most brilliant experts on this region, they fail to predict the most important things that happen at various stages in this conflict. So, and of course, it's very difficult to predict, how our region will look like, after the war in Ukraine ends. But I think that this recent visit of Aliyev to Moscow, and we know that there was this declaration of alliance signed with Russia. We know that it has not the same weight as the declaration that Azerbaijan signed with Turkey, Shusha declaration last year. But what we don't know, I think this is the most interesting thing. We don't know what kind of negotiations happen between Aliyev, Erdogan, and Putin. We don't know how the balance of power will look like after this war, regardless of Russia losing or winning and how we define victory or loss. I think the Russia will just have more power and will be ready to move to use also more naked power in its immediate neighborhood, including in the South Caucasus, and I think that we really may not know what has been negotiated or has not been negotiated, and how what may be the outcome and the result of these negotiations. So that is, I think, very important to note. Regarding domestic politics, I think that it's not a secret. So as a result of the war, of the recent war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev has cemented its power in Azerbaijan. So there was, and I'm sure there were a lot of comments and articles and analysis about this. So I don't want to go into this topic. But what is more interesting, I think, that how this war in Ukraine and its aftermath may influence politics in Armenia, in Azerbaijan. I think in regard to Azerbaijan, it will have implications because there are about plus minus 3 million Azerbaijanis living in Russia, and the remittances they were sending home were very important in Azerbaijan. So this will, we can expect drastically will go down. I remember in 90s there was always this talk about one leverage that Russia has against Azerbaijan, that they could just send all Azerbaijanis home from Russia, and it would mean that suddenly we have 1, 2 million or even hundreds of thousands of jobless people in Azerbaijan. So now I think, for example, we don't know how. I mean, we know that the situation, economic situation will, how economic situation will look like in Russia, very soon, after all these unprecedented sanctions against Russia, and this will definitely, it can create also the wave of immigration or all the wave of all these Azerbaijanis living in Russia coming back to Azerbaijan, and this of course can make political situation in Azerbaijan a little bit more tense. In my view, it's also Azerbaijan, Armenia. I think all of us were entering the unknown territory, very dangerous situation, where Russia will definitely try to use both Armenia and Azerbaijan to avoid some of sanctions, to use these territories for countries for various purposes, and it really remains to be seen. And of course, this again danger is more for Armenia because Armenia is a member of ODKB, this military union with Russia, and Eurasian Economic Union, which, by the way, recently they were discussing how to minimize the impact of sanctions, on other member countries in Eurasian Economic Union. But I think with Azerbaijan, Russia has very close relationship, a lot of business, a lot of connectivity. So I think that it will be interesting to see how Armenia and Azerbaijan will try to avoid, being put in one or another box that is currently being created in our reality and in our world. And for Azerbaijan, it definitely becomes more and more difficult to perform its balancing act, and trying to have a meaningful, respectful, and still independent, policy from Russia. And of course, even the reaction of Azerbaijan to the war in Ukraine, it was very interesting to observe just a couple of weeks before the war started, when it was very intense stage, pre-war stage. Aliyev made official visit to Ukraine and tried to show also, as always, its support to territorial integrity of Ukraine. But on the other hand, of course, there was a visit to Moscow just the next day after the Luhansk and Donetsk People Republics were recognized by Russia, and then this declaration of alliance with Russia was signed. And I think that in Azerbaijani society, the reaction, of course, there was a lot of support for Ukraine and a lot of criticism towards government because of its, the signing of this declaration of alliance with Russia. But then also what happened, Azerbaijan was the first country from immediate neighborhood of Russia, from post-Soviet countries, except Baltic countries, to send humanitarian help, assistance to Ukraine. And so the fuel that they were also said they will give for free and started giving for free to Ukrainian doctors and for various other purposes. So it is difficult. It's definitely becoming more and more difficult for Azerbaijan, and I think for Armenia and for Georgia, to keep this balance and really to appease Russia, because I think this is what will happen, is Russia will become more and more assertive. I would like maybe also Arman will now talk about domestic politics. Like, I am observing Armenian experts, some of them saying that we need to get even closer to Russia, right? Because that some of them, and I ask myself how else closer you can become to Russia. I also ask the same question for Azerbaijan. I mean, what else may Russia want from Azerbaijan? And I'm afraid this, of course, will create more and more tensions also within Azerbaijan. The way what Russia will demand from Azerbaijan government and how Azerbaijan government will react to this.
Before we get to domestic politics, I just want to add one more question. to both of you, and then I think we should open it up to the group. I'd like to hear you speak about the relationship between the normalization processes between Armenia and Azerbaijan and Armenia and Turkey, how they affect each other, how one affects the other. So if you could address that in addition to talking about the effects on domestic politics, that would be wonderful.
Thank you. So I want to focus on domestic politics with a very specific angle. There is, and usually wars, especially wars with such decisive outcome, settle certain things, and settle certain things in domestic debates as well. And one thing that could be rationally expected in Armenia after the war would be the complete discrediting and the complete delegitimation of certain ideologies and political forces in the country that one could describe, basically describe as hardliners. Now, interestingly, though, hardliners were not discredited, and this has something to do even after such a decisive outcome, and even after it was obvious to some people, myself included, that they should have become discredited. I mean, the war and its outcome showed the bankruptcy of their ideas. But what had happened was you had two camps of hardliners in Armenia. Essentially, when Pashinyan came to power, it was this new revolutionary force, and it was seen mostly as a challenge to the old school. And the old school actually described Pashinyan as stooge of foreign powers, and he has come to sell Karabakh, he has come to sell Armenia's interests, and he has all sorts of nefarious agendas, etc., etc. The truth is that Pashinyan was competing with them on who is more hardline, and in fact, I think Pashinyan overdid by some amount. I mean, his diplomacy proved to be a lot more radical in some ways than what the diplomacy of Robert Kocayan and Serge Sarkisyan was. Now, however, it was Pashinyan that was in power when the war happened, and a lot of the responsibility for its outcome was laid at Pashinyan's feet. Also, since Pashinyan is the government, is the leader, and Pashinyan's party is in power. Now, after the war, a lot of the concessions, a lot of the conciliatory rhetoric that they have to adopt, they are forced on them, in essence. But the hardliners are, they have a very easy time of presenting this as, again, selling out Armenia's interests and essentially selling out Karabakh and basically doing Azerbaijans, and sometimes they also say Turkey's bidding in these negotiations. The bottom line is that you have this bifurcation in Armenia, and regardless of what you think about Pashinyan and the crowd around him, you do have in the society a clear division between those who think that Armenia probably should reconcile with certain hard realities of power, and try to make peace with its neighbors, try to negotiate some kind of a modus vivendi with its neighbors, and those who are still beholden to the old ideas. And it's not like they are saying now that Armenia has the wherewithal to do something else, but the argument of hardliners sometimes is you can't come to any agreement with our neighbors. Our neighbors are not there to extract particular concessions and be satisfied by them. Our neighbors want to eliminate us completely and completely finish us off. Now, regardless of what one might think about such arguments, and I think such arguments are quite silly, But the domestic framework for these ideas, the domestic competition between these different forces, is strongly affected by how these negotiations are being conducted. They are strongly affected by the behavior of Armenia's neighbors, and in particular, I would argue that the kind of position that Azerbaijan seems to have adopted after the war, which is we have won and we're going to exploit the advantages that we have gained as a result of this victory to the fullest, and we're going to extract all the concessions we can from Armenia, and that actually is strongly affecting the domestic political conversation in Armenia. So it delegitimizes and it weakens the case of those who argue that peace is possible, good neighborly relations are possible, and coexistence is possible, and it strengthens the positions of those who argue otherwise. Now, it may be, it is perfectly understandable that in Azerbaijan they may think it doesn't matter, they don't care. But under different scenarios, the Azerbaijani government, the Azerbaijani leaders might be interested in having a situation where there is more of a positive disposition in Armenia towards peace. In other words, where peace is not simply imposed on there is nothing we can do about it. So whatever is imposed on us we'll take. But if there is going to be a constituency for peace in Armenia, I think Azerbaijan's behavior is relevant. And again, I mean, I don't know what the future configuration is going to be, and whether Azerbaijan is going to be allowed to succeed in extracting the maximum amount of concessions from Armenia. Because I mean, this is another thing I wanted to say before. When these 5 points were released, when that document was published, I mean, I was looking at it, and the first question that came to my mind was, do the Azerbaijani leaders think that they are really negotiating this issue with Armenia? I mean, if it was just Armenia that was their problem, right, that problem could have been solved a lot more easily, given Armenia's defeat and Armenia's inability to resist, which is not a secret. I mean, Armenia has been weakened terribly after the war, but clearly Armenia is not the only relevant actor in those negotiations, and what happens in those negotiations is going to be of interest to other actors as well. And I think that is also something that the Azerbaijani leaders probably should take into account when designing their strategy. I don't know if I answered that. Yeah, so the other question about the Armenian-Turkish relations. Now, there has been a process, as everybody knows, and after the war, I think the rhetoric has changed, the atmosphere has changed between the two countries. There are special envoys appointed by both the Turkish and the Armenian governments to negotiate the process of establishing diplomatic relations. And there is a lot of optimism that these relations will be normalized soon. And the question is, what is holding it back? What may be an obstacle? And there is nothing really complicated here. I mean, one looks at the Armenian-Turkish relations, and they would be excused to think that there are a ton of real big issues that are preventing the normalization of relations between these two countries. There are a lot of issues that are preventing reconciliation between the two societies. But as far as the normalization of relations between the two states is concerned, there's been only one issue that has been the key obstacle, the precondition, and that has been the resolution of the Karabakh conflict. So now it's no different from what it has been before. I mean, there are certainly differences, but in principle, the same issue is holding back the normalization between Armenia and Turkey. I think Turkey is basically waiting to make sure that the Armenian-Azerbaijani dialogue is concluded successfully before it establishes diplomatic relations with Armenia. I don't think there is anything more complicated than that in this triangular context.
Thank you to both of you.